A young man on the verge of marriage discovers that his father, an unscrupulous businessman, was responsible for his fiancée's family's downfall. Shocked, he confronts his father, who admits to his actions without remorse. Then the son does this. Edward grew up in a home marked by the emotional absence of his father, George, a powerful businessman who always placed his work above any family bond. From a young age, Edward had to deal with his father's coldness, who barely participated in his life and dedicated himself exclusively to the growth of his empire. When his mother, Elizabeth, tragically died in a fire, Edward lost his only emotional support, and the distance from George intensified. Without his mother, and ignored by his father, Edward learned to be independent, but he never stopped feeling the weight of the loneliness and emptiness that his family left him with. Edward always felt like a shadow in his father George's life, whose attention was almost entirely focused on business. One day, after arriving home, he tried once again to talk to his father, who was on the phone in his office, analyzing spreadsheets and checking contracts. "Dad, do you have a minute?" Edward asked, eagerly waiting on the other side of the desk. George glanced briefly at him, with little interest. "Edward, now is not a good time. We'll talk later." "Oh, and it's quick. I just wanted to talk about—" George, already impatient, interrupted. "Edward, not now. I need to focus on something important." Edward sighed, used to being brushed aside. It had become a natural part of his life, and even though he tried, it never seemed to get his father's attention. At one point his phone buzzed, pulling him out of that cold and indifferent room. It was a message from his friend Emily. "Hey Rafa, are we going to a party tomorrow? Everyone is going. It's going to be amazing. You need to get out a little." Edward read the message, and after a second responded, "Sure. Where is it?" Emily sent the address and details, excited. Tired of his father's indifference and looking for something to break the monotony, Edward decided it would be good to accept the invitation and distract himself a little. The next day, he arrived at the party and was greeted by Emily, who welcomed him with an excited smile. "I'm so glad you came. You really needed some fun, right?" Edward smiled. "Yeah, I guess I did." As the upbeat music filled the space and people danced and chatted, Edward loosened up a bit, enjoying the energy of the place. At one point, he stopped by the drinks table, and that's when he saw her. Carol, with a sparkle in her eye and a smile that seemed to light up the room. She was talking with some friends, but her eyes met his for an instant, and they both smiled somewhat shyly. Deciding to get to know her, Edward approached. "Hi, I'm Edward," he said, smiling. "Hi, Edward," Carol replied, returning the smile. "I'm Carol. You're Emily's friend, right?" "Yeah, she dragged me here," Edward said, laughing. "And you? How do you know everyone?" Carol explained that she was a childhood friend of one of the party organizers, and gradually their conversation flowed naturally. They talked about various topics, and Edward felt at ease, something that was rare for him. He found her charming, with a way of speaking that conveyed a sweetness and sincerity. "What do you do for a living, Edward?" Carol asked, interested. "I'm still studying," he replied. "And you?" "I help my parents with their business," Carol responded. "They have a small sewing business. They work a lot, but they enjoy what they do." Edward nodded. "That's cool. It must be nice to have such involved parents," he said with a slight tone of melancholy. Carol noticed the change in tone and kindly asked, "And your parents? What do they do?" "My mum passed away a few years ago, in a fire. Since then, I've lived only with my dad, but he's a very busy man," Edward explained, carefully choosing his words. Carol's expression became understanding. "I'm so sorry, Edward. That must have been tough." He shrugged, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, but it's part of it. I've learned to deal with it." The night went on, and Edward and Carol stayed together. They talked and laughed until the end of the party. When the event was about to end, Edward, somewhat hesitant, asked, "Carol, can I get your number? I'd like to see you again." She smiled, taking her phone to type his number. "Sure, Edward. I'd like that too." In the following days, they exchanged messages and soon arranged another meeting, this time for a quiet coffee. With each meeting, their connection grew stronger, and they became more comfortable sharing details about their lives and families. Carol spoke fondly of her parents, who, though they led a simple life, were hard-working and dedicated. "My parents always worked really hard to keep the business going," she said during one of their meetups. "They built everything with their own hands." Edward listened with admiration and a slight tinge of envy. "You're lucky. They seem amazing. I never had that," he confessed. "My dad was always absent, cold, you know. All he cares about is business." Carol looked at him with empathy. "That must be hard to grow up like that. But you seem like such a good and strong person, Edward." He smiled, feeling seen in a way he wasn't used to. "Thanks, Carol." Over time, the feelings between them blossomed. One day, while they were walking through a park, Edward stopped and looked at her, a bit nervous. "Carol, would you like to be my girlfriend?" She smiled, emotional, and nodded. "Yes, Edward, I'd love to." And so began their relationship, with regular meetups and a constant exchange of confidences. Although Edward hadn't yet told his father about the relationship, he felt happier and lighter by Carol's side, as if he had finally found someone with whom he could build a true connection and who gave him the affection he had always sought in his life. After some time in his relationship with Carol, Edward decided it was time to tell his father about her, even though he knew it might not be well received. He waited until late afternoon, when George seemed less busy, or at least appeared to be. He knocked on the office door and entered. "Dad, I wanted to talk to you," Edward began with some apprehension. George looked up over the papers on his desk, raising an eyebrow. "Say it quickly, Edward. I have a lot to resolve." I wanted to tell you that I'm dating someone. We've been together for a while and I'd like you to know," Edward said, trying to keep his tone firm. George remained silent for a moment before replying with his characteristic coldness. "And this girl, is she from a rich family?" Edward, already anticipating the line of questioning, sighed, but replied, "No, Dad. Her parents own a small sewing business. They work hard, but they're not rich." George's face hardened. "Then how can you be sure she's not interested in our family's money? Do you think these humble people don't see you as an opportunity?" The question hit Edward like a blow, and he clenched his fists. "You know, Dad, I thought you'd be happy for me, that you'd care about me for once. But this is all you think about. You don't even know me properly. You've never cared about me. And now, when I finally find something that makes me happy, you only think about money." George raised his voice, his authoritarian tone imposing. "Watch your words, Edward. I'm your father, and I still demand respect. If you want to be with this girl, do what you want, but don't come asking for my approval for any sentimental nonsense." He stood up, already looking at the papers on his desk. "Now, get out of here. I have more important things to resolve." Edward felt the rage and disappointment burn inside him, but he left the room knowing that insisting wouldn't change anything. After that conversation, George, restless, began to investigate Carol's family. He secretly hired a private investigator to look into the finances and businesses of her parents. He wanted to know every detail, from the contracts they signed to the financial struggles they faced. For George, the only concern was ensuring that the empire he had built wasn't threatened. There was no genuine care for his son or his relationship. In a few weeks, George knew everything about Carol's family's economic situation and convinced himself that her interests might not be so pure. Meanwhile, Edward and Carol's relationship continued to grow. Over 12 months passed with meetups and confidences, and they found support and affection in each other, which they both valued deeply. Carol was a safe harbor for Edward, someone with whom he could talk about everything, including the wounds he carried from his relationship with his father. One day, during a quiet meet, Carol seemed worried. After a few minutes of silence, she sighed and looked at Edward. "I have something to tell you. My parents' business. It went bankrupt." Edward took her hand, trying to comfort her. "What happened, Carol?" she explained sadly. "They did a deal with a businessman who seemed interested in a partnership, but he ended up manipulating the whole situation. After that, we were left without capital and no credit to continue." Edward squeezed her hand tighter. "That's horrible, Carol. I'm so sorry you're going through this." "Thank you, Edward," she replied, giving a small smile. "But I know my parents are strong. They'll start over one way or another." A few months later, Edward made an important decision. He decided that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Carol. At a special dinner, under the soft lights of the restaurant, he looked into her eyes and said, "Carol, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Carol became emotional, and after a second of surprise, she said, "Yes, Edward, of course I will." The two embraced, smiling, but Carol quickly made a suggestion that surprised him. "Edward, there's one thing. It's been so long since you've met my family, and I've never met your dad. I think he should be involved in this moment too. I'd like to meet him." Edward remained silent, thoughtful. Carol's desire was understandable, but he knew how cold and indifferent his father could be. Still, he agreed. "You're right, Carol. He needs to meet you. I'll arrange a dinner for that." Days later, Edward went to his father's office. When he entered, he saw George focused on documents, but he decided to speak, even though his father seemed busy. "Dad, I wanted to tell you something," Edward said firmly. George looked at him with little interest. "Just say it quickly, Edward. I'm in the middle of an analysis." Edward ignored the comment. "I'm going to marry Carol. I want you to meet her. I've arranged a dinner for us in a few days." George let out a slight sigh of disdain, but replied briefly, "Do whatever you want." Edward took a deep breath, knowing that his father's cold presence could affect the special moment he and Carol were expecting. "Dad, I just ask that, for one night, you act a little less cold. This is an important moment for me." George looked at Edward with an empty expression, without any empathy. "Fine," he replied, as though he didn't really care. Without another word, Edward left, frustrated but determined to move forward. He knew the dinner would be a definitive test for what was to come, both in his personal life and in his relationship with his father. The dinner finally arrived. Edward and Carol arrived together at George's house, where a table elegantly set awaited them in the dining room. As soon as George appeared to greet them, Carol froze, her face went pale, and the shock was impossible to hide. It was him, the man who had ruined her parents' business, the one who had visited their house on several occasions under the pretext of a business partnership. George looked at her with a slight smile, which quickly turned into an intimidating look, while Edward, excited, made the introductions without noticing Carol's discomfort. "Carol, this is my dad, George. Dad, this is Carol." George looked at her directly in the eyes and gave a cold nod. "Nice to meet you, Carol. My dad is reserved, but he's a good person," he said, making an effort to convince her, or perhaps himself. "It's just the tiredness," she replied, keeping her eyes fixed on her plate. George watched the scene without saying much, occasionally staring at Carol with a challenging look, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind and was enjoying it. The hours dragged on, and Edward noticed the tension, though he didn't know the reason. When the dinner finally ended, Edward said goodbye to his father and took Carol home. The drive was silent and he felt something was wrong, but decided to wait until they were alone to talk. As they arrived at Carol's house, he stopped the car and before she could leave, asked, "Carol, what happened? You barely spoke during the dinner and you seemed so uncomfortable." She took a deep breath, holding back tears, until, unable to contain herself, she started to cry. "Edward, your dad, George, he was the man who destroyed my family's business." Edward stood still, her words echoing in his mind. "What? How do you mean, Carol?" "It was him, Edward. George approached my parents with partnership proposals, said he wanted to do business with them, that he'd help them expand, but it was all a lie. He manipulated the contracts, put us in an impossible situation, and then left us with no way out. Because of him, we lost everything." With each word of Carol's, Edward's surprise turned into rage, the blood pulsing in his temples. "He really did that? To your family?" Carol nodded, still crying. "I love you, Edward, but I can't marry you knowing that your dad was the one who destroyed my parents' lives." Edward took a deep breath, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions. I'll fix this today, Carol, I promise." They said goodbye with a tight hug, and Edward drove home with his mind consumed by anger and the need to confront his father. Upon arriving home, Edward went straight to George's office. He didn't even bother to knock, opening the door with force, the sound echoing through the hall and interrupting the silence. George, who was as usual absorbed in his work, lifted his gaze, surprised and annoyed by the abrupt entrance. "Edward, what do you think you're doing? Don't you see I'm busy?" George began to speak but was interrupted. "You're always busy, aren't you?" Edward retorted, his voice filled with contempt. "You only care about these damn spreadsheets and contracts. But today, you're going to listen to me whether you want to or not." George furrowed his brow, trying to stay calm. "Watch your words, Edward. I'm your father." Edward let out a bitter laugh, disbelief and anger written across his face. "Father? Do you think you deserve to be called a father? All you've done is think about what suits you, without ever asking me what I want. And now you destroy Carol's life and her family's life. And you call yourself my father?" George sighed, as if Edward's outburst was just an inconvenience. "Edward, you're young, naive. You don't understand what it takes to protect what we've built. I did this for your own good." Edward looked at him incredulously. "For my good? Destroying the life of honest people who just wanted to build something for themselves? That's for my good?" George looked at him with hard, cold eyes. "Yes, exactly. I knew that if that girl was really a gold digger, she'd lose interest in you as soon as her parents' business went bankrupt. She was probably just by your side for convenience, seeing you as a way to rise above, an opportunity to solve her family's financial problems." Edward fell silent for a second, shocked by the lack of remorse in his father's voice. But George continued, his tone becoming even more indifferent. "I did what any sensible man would do to protect the family's wealth. Our name, Edward, carries weight. And people like her parents. They were just taking advantage. They saw an opportunity when you showed up, an influential, naive young man, and they clung to it." Edward clenched his fists. "So you destroyed their livelihood. You drove an entire family into bankruptcy just to test if she was with me for interest." George gave a slight condescending smile. "Exactly. It was a test, and if she really loved you, it wouldn't change anything. But I needed to be sure that you weren't being manipulated, that our wealth wasn't at risk." Edward stood his ground. "So you destroyed the life of people who only wanted to work, who just wanted a decent future, to protect your precious company, and you think that's okay?" George shrugged. "What you don't understand, Edward, is that this company was built with sacrifice. And I'm not going to allow any girl whom you barely know to threaten what I've spent decades building. What you call cruelty, I call precaution. And honestly, I don't regret it. I did what needed to be done. Edward stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. Precaution? Destroying the lives of people who only wanted to work and have a dignified future is precaution to you. The only thing you did was make sure that I could never look at you with respect again. George shrugged. Respect? I don't need your respect, Edward. I need your obedience and your intelligence to carry on what I've built. But if you prefer to risk it all for a girl from a humble background, that's a choice you'll make, and the consequences will be very clear. Edward, filled with fury, felt the last bit of respect completely drained from him. You know what's pathetic about this, Dad? You're so obsessed with protecting your money that you prefer to ruin others' happiness. You're so obsessed with power that you don't even understand that what you have is just emptiness. You have no one. Emptiness? You don't know what you're talking about. George shot back, his expression cold. I have power, respect, and security, and that's not emptiness. It's solid. It's what really matters. But that's all you have. No love, no true loyalty, no one to come home to. Not even a son who respects you, and you know why? Edward began shouting, his words filled with disdain. Because you've never been a father to me. You don't know anything about loving someone, about having a connection with someone that goes beyond interest. And that's why, from now on, I don't have a father anymore. George looked at him, his expression unmoving. Calm down, Edward. You're exaggerating, dramatizing. This is ridiculous. Edward cut him off, fury spilling over. Ridiculous? The only ridiculous thing here is you, Dad. You've always thought you could control everything and everyone around you. But look at you now. The only person who might still have cared about you just lost any feeling for who you are. Stop it, Edward! George raised his voice, trying to assert his authority. But Edward didn't back down. No, now it's you who will listen to me. My whole life you've been absent, distant, cold. You never cared about what I wanted or what made me happy. And now, when I finally find someone who makes me feel something real, you think you can ruin everything. George tried to speak, but Edward interrupted him with determination. You ruined everything, Dad. And now you'll live with the consequences. Because I'm no longer part of this family. I don't want anything from you, from your company, or your fortune. Live alone with your money, because that's all you'll have from now on. And, without another word, Edward turned and left, leaving George alone in his office, surrounded by documents and contracts, everything he had, but which at that moment seemed absurdly empty. That night, Edward, still seething with anger and disappointment, packed some bags quickly, grabbed the car keys, and drove to Carol's house. When he arrived, it was already late, and her parents were surprised to see him there, especially at that hour and with bags in hand. Carol approached, visibly worried, not knowing what might have happened after the tense dinner. Edward, what's going on? She asked, apprehensive. Edward looked at her and her parents with a determined yet pained look. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I needed to come here and talk to all of you. I know it's not easy, and that there are no excuses for what my dad did to you, but today everything changed. I've broken ties with him. I no longer have any connection to George. Carol's parents exchanged glances, surprised and cautious. Her father, Mr. David, stepped forward and looked Edward in the eye. Edward, we know what happened wasn't your fault, but do you understand this isn't simple for us? Edward nodded, seriousness clear in his face. I know, Mr. David. You've built something with so much effort, something he destroyed without hesitation, as if you were disposable pieces in his power game. But I'm here to say, I'm no longer involved with what he represents. I want to start over, by Carol's side, and help you rebuild what was taken. Carol's mother, Mrs. Angela, who had been silently watching, approached with a careful expression. Edward, this is a big step. Abandoning your family, your inheritance. Edward took a deep breath, holding Carol's hand. I don't care about the inheritance anymore, Mrs. Angela. George chose his money and his company. I choose something much more important. Carol and this family you've built. I ask that you give me a chance to be with you and rebuild what he destroyed. Carol, emotional, squeezed Edward's hand and turned to her parents, who after a long silence nodded, their expressions softening as they accepted that request. Well, if this is really your choice, Edward, Mr. David said, extending his hand in a gesture of peace, I think we all deserve a second chance. In the months that followed, Edward worked alongside David and Angela, dedicating himself to rebuilding Carol's family's sewing business. He learned about the craft, what it meant to deal with suppliers, deadlines, and customers, and the satisfaction that came from honest work, something he had never experienced in George's empire. With each achievement, he and Carol grew closer, supporting each other and building something solid, far removed from the luxury and values that Edward's father held dear. Time passed, and finally, Edward and Carol decided to get married. The wedding was simple and intimate, with close family and friends. Without George's presence, the atmosphere was light, filled with true love and joy, devoid of the coldness and demands that had always surrounded Edward's life. He knew that this moment would never have happened if he had stayed with his father, tied to the idea of an empire without life. Meanwhile, George, isolated in his mansion, lived surrounded only by his material possessions and the empire he had built, but which now seemed empty and purposeless. The days passed, and he rarely had contact with anyone other than his staff and lawyers. After Edward's definitive departure, George noticed that there was no one left to share his achievements with, and loneliness began to weigh on him. At first, he tried to ignore the emptiness, keeping busy with the business and the endless meetings he loved. But little by little, the lonely moments in his large house became unbearable. He sat in his office every night, reviewing papers that once brought him satisfaction, but now seemed insignificant. The walls, once a symbol of success, had become a constant reminder of what he had lost. Eventually, George tried to reconnect with distant family members, but no one was willing to get close. Over the years, Carol's family business began to grow again, and Edward, by his wife's side, saw the fruits of their hard work and shared love. He had built a new legacy, a legacy of integrity and true values, far from the cold empire of George. George, now old and alone, reflected in silence, surrounded by the emptiness of his own actions. His empire continued to thrive, but there was no one there to inherit or care. He realized that power and money, which he had always considered the center of life, meant nothing without someone to share them with. When night fell, the silence filled the corridors, and George, surrounded only by what he thought was the ultimate symbol of success, faced the real weight of his choices. Meanwhile, Edward and Carol continued with the life they had chosen. The price of his ambition had become clear, the isolation he had created for himself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.